So our next speaker is Justin Grimmer. Justin is an associate professor of political science at Stanford University. He holds a PhD in political science from Harvard University. His research examines how representation occurs in American politics. He's a leading scholar in both the subfields of American politics as well as methodology, and is published widely in the most prestigious journals in both of these areas. His 2013 book, Representational Style in Congress, won the prestigious Richard Fenno Award, which is a major award in political science. So Justin's going to give a talk on measuring how politicians and the public communicate, creating and destroying party brands. Thank you.
Thank you. Really excited to talk to you all. Okay, so to start, let's begin with one of my favorite members of Congress, Ted Cruz, making lots of news recently, running for president. But I want to take us back a little bit and give some Cruz history. And in particular, tell you about September 24th, 2013. If you pay any attention to American politics, you may remember this event. So Ted Cruz goes to the floor and he gives this sort of, it's like a filibuster. It's not really a filibuster because he wasn't really stopping anything, but he did get to talk a lot and really raise his profile. And in this speech, which is a sort of an epic moment, sort of vintage Ted Cruz, you know, he's articulate for about 17.5 hours more than I can be articulate. He makes a lot of allegations. He reads Green Eggs and Ham to his kids, which is the exact wrong metaphor for what he was trying to say. He sort of discusses how various members of the Senate are sort of like his children. And, you know, one of the most serious allegations he makes in trying to stop a vote that would sort of implicitly continue to fund Obamacare, is that Obamacare has produced a lost generation. And in this way, you could think, what is Ted Cruz trying to do? Well, Ted Cruz is really trying to establish himself as the leader of the anti-Obamacare GOP, and in particular, the sort of anti-Obama component of the GOP. Lots of folks are sort of wrangling for that mantle. This is a way for him very publicly to come out and establish himself in that way. Right after this happens, Cruz raised his profile in a big way. He's already a prominent person. He sort of establishes himself as a national name. So if you look at the talking heads, what are they saying? They say right after this that Cruz now leads a national Republican field. After this happened, he actually secured about $1.3 million in campaign donations. So this was a fairly lucrative thing for him to do. And another talking head said, you know, this was a stunt. No doubt about that, but it was an effective one. Effective in the sense that it raised his profile and it secured him a lot more campaign cash. Other Republicans are not really happy that this happened. So John McCain, right after Ted Cruz sits down, goes to the floor and he reprimands Cruz. He says, I do not appreciate the sort of allegations that are made. In particular, Cruz labeled the people who had let Obamacare stand as sort of appeasers that are sort of analogous to the folks who are appeasing Hitler. McCain said, maybe that's stretching it a little bit. Maybe this thing that's giving healthcare to a few people isn't quite like Nazism, but, you know. Even Karl Rove condemned this sort of act as a sort of out there, not particularly effective move for the Republican Party. And so Ted Cruz, in response to this, you know, there's sort of this backlash. Other Republicans are like, hey, Ted, knock it off. And that you're hurting the Republican brand. And Ted says, no, I haven't hurt the Republican brand at all. And yet, immediately after this sort of government shutdown and this sort of speech by Cruz, there's a 10 percentage point drop in the GOP ratings. And so there seems to be some tension here that this case really illuminates. There's the incentives for people like Ted Cruz who want to sort of bolster his image with the base, in particular a conservative base that is very, very opposed to the Obama administration. And at the same time, the Republican Party in general wants to present itself as an effective way. And there's a large sort of cadre of people in the Republican Party who all have to share this brand. And so this talk today is largely about how these brands get created and the sort of dynamics that Cruz illuminates. And in particular, what I'm going to tell you about is how this marketing effort works. And so we can think about a party brand, at least political scientists have thought about party brands as a reputation. It's based in part perhaps on the policies that a party might try to pass. But when a party is an out party or doesn't hold a particularly large amount of institutional power, it may do other things like try to establish its competence or its opposition to certain kinds of policies. And so what this research is really focusing on is the marketing effort that goes along with this brand. So rather than just what happens in the institution, we want to know and try to better understand how politicians themselves are trying to craft their party's brand. So they can do this in a positive way. They can go out and talk about all the great things that Ted Cruz would do as president and the way he'd sort of establish a Republican Party. Or they can do this while on the attack. They can go out and try to destroy the other party's brand or undermine what the other party's up to. And what I'm going to show you is that extremists, the people who are at the most ideological extreme members of both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, are going to make disproportionate contributions to this marketing effort. And the result of this, I'll show, is that the rhetoric that goes around this sort of party branding is more critical and in some ways hyperbolic than it would be if the median member of a party was speaking. And it's also going to be more vitriolic. And I'll sort of craft that and define that in a very specific way. And so the big question then for the party, and the question that this leads to, so thinking about normatively, is who is the party spokesperson? Who gets to hold that mantle as the Republican Party's official party spokesperson? Because of the sort of nature of American democracy, there's no clear answer, especially when the party doesn't hold the presidency. Okay, so I'm gonna present results from two different papers. So the first thing is going to be about essentially how the Republican Party has shifted its brand and to attack the Democratic brand after Obama's election. And so what I'll show you in work that sort of replicates work that I've done in prior studies, but now with a sort of different measurement approach, is that there's a big decrease in the rate at which Republicans are claiming credit for money in their districts. In particular, Republicans become fairly disinterested in talking about money in their districts. And instead, they replace this with critical statements, that is, statements that are much more directly attacking the Obama administration. But this isn't a sort of uniform change across the Republican Party. In particular, conservatives are going to be driving this change, the most conservative members of the Republican Party. And to show this, this change, I'm going to measure legislators' express priorities. And to do that, I'm going to introduce an unsupervised method that measures authors' attentions to topics. And it's going to actually impose a hierarchy on topics. So we'll have some specific or granular topics, and we'll nest those in some coarse topics. And I'm going to apply this to a big collection of House press releases, about 170,000. And then also I'll apply it to an original collection of House and Senate electronic newsletters. There'll be about 40,000 of those. It'll be nice because the House and Senate newsletters give us a different time period than the press releases. And what I'll also show you is that extremists drive shifts in vitriolic rhetoric in the institution. And so this is data that's really hot off the presses. We're extending it 7 years further, so it's a collaborative project. And what I'll show you is that there's been increases in vitriol in the Senate over the last, say, 20 years, but it's not a simple secular change. It isn't as if things are just getting worse in the Congress, and you know, it's because of a variety of reasons, because people don't have lunch together is the most popular one. It's sort of absurd. Instead, increases in vitriol correlate with things like being a member of an out party, wanting to be critical of what the majority party is doing, or if there's an unpopular president. And I'll show you that extremists are going to drive this increase as well. And so the evidence for this, I'll estimate taunting rates, the extent to which members of a party attack the other party. And we're going to do this with a wide array of hand-coded speeches. Okay. So let's dive right in and begin to measure what people are saying, what members of Congress are saying to their constituents. And so to do that, I'm going to develop a model that's going to measure how legislators divide their attention across a set of topics. And in particular, I'm going to use a model that's going to be built around two hierarchies. And so let's focus first on the press releases. The idea with this model is that we'll suppose that legislators, members of Congress, are issuing press releases. Legislators have some attention that they want to dedicate to a particular set of topic, and those press releases are how they allocate their attention. There'll be a second hierarchy here that I'll also build in, and what I'm going to suppose is that when legislators are deciding to allocate their attention, that there's a set of, say, granular or more specific topics where they might allocate their attention. But I'll suppose that those granular topics are nested in a set of more coarse or refined, or more coarse topics, less refined topics. And those coarse topics are going to give us a broader sense, a broader thematic sense of what people are talking about. The granular topics will give us a much more specific sense of what's being discussed. Okay? And so using this model and built around these two hierarchies, we can estimate 4 quantities of interest using our press releases. So the first are going to be a set of granular topics. We'll assume there's 44 of those. And the second will be a set of coarse or broad topics. So those 44 topics will nest into 7 coarse topics. And again, just to be clear what's going on here, each one of these granular topics is going to sit within one of these coarse topics. And we'll also then measure each legislator's priorities. And so the idea with this priorities is that we'll get a sense of how a legislator is dividing his or her attention across each of these categories. This has to sum up to 1. And so a larger share allocated to any one category means that that legislator is allocating less attention to other categories. And then along the way, we'll also get each one of these press releases, both granular and coarse topic. Okay, so let's dive in and get a little bit more specific on this model. And so specifically, we'll assume that legislators have this divided attention across these topics. Then conditional on that divided attention, we're going to draw a topic label for each one of our press releases. And then conditional on that topic label for a press release, we'll draw the content of a press release. And so the idea is, conditional on knowing what category a press release comes from, we can run over to a category-specific distribution, and that category-specific distribution then tells us what words are going to be in that press release. And so the key really is then that each one of these topics sort of gives its own model or distribution over words. All right? And so then we can finish the model by having this nesting by supposing each one of these granular topics itself is nested within a coarse topic. So using this model then, we're going to get those quantities of interest. We can estimate it actually quite quickly with both the press releases and the newsletters by using a method that allows us to move deterministically. Okay, so what do we find? So one of the things that's powerful about these sorts of text as data methods is that, especially this one, doesn't require a lot of pre-processing work. There's a little secret sauce going on underneath here where I've represented text as data, so I can apply these sorts of models. But then once I've done that, I can just sort of throw the model at it, and then the model will come back with some estimates. But then the real work begins with these sorts of models, because we have to figure out what categories this model is suggesting exist, and if they're actually meaningful at all. They could just be noise, they could just be useless. And so this first category, this first coarse category and subsequent granular categories is actually quite useful for understanding what people are talking about. So this label over here to the left is something that I labeled by hand by reading a lot of the press releases that are assigned to this category. And I'm going to call it credit claiming. And by credit claiming, I mean these are press releases that are designed to make sure a legislator gets credit for money that's spent in his or her district. Okay? And so the words that this algorithm identifies as words that are highly prevalent in press releases that are from this category are words like fund, grant, water, because there's a lot of sort of water right grants going on during this time period, and program. And this turns out to be about 19% of all press releases. So then the granular topics tell us more specifically about what people are talking about. So some of the categories make sense. So stimulus funding is something perhaps we'd expect given this time period. These are press releases from 2005 to 2010. Transportation funds and municipal grants also make sense. Fire department grants are my favorite category of press releases. So we validated this number of ways. They are about 2.5% of all press releases sent from members of Congress are about fire department grants. So why would this be the case? Because this agency is creating these opportunities for members of Congress. There are really entrepreneurial bureaucrats at this fire department agency. They're funneling information in congressional offices and making sure they're very prominent. Okay, so this aggregates up together. This is a big category of political action. It's something, this category of action has actually been discussed for quite some time in political science. It dates back, I mean, as long as there's been government spending, there's been politicians or people who are like politicians who are trying to get credit for that spending. As a formal category, this dates back to David Mayhew's classic work in 1974, and yet the model is able to retrieve it with very little extra work attached. This is just something that comes out of the model. And what also comes out of this is some really fascinating dynamics that align well with our intuitions about what's going on with American politics at this time. Before we get there, this looks, on its face, it looks great, right? Looks like there's some compelling evidence. We may want to know, though, that the category, that these labels actually are, in fact, credit claiming, because the model could just be doing something weird. After all, it's a statistical model of language. No document has ever been produced by the model I just wrote down, right? So it's like wrong on its face. And like violently wrong. It's like so horribly wrong. If you tried to write like this, you'd be put in an insane asylum, right? Like, it's really, really wrong. So the question is, does this actually capture anything real? So luckily, with this press release case, I spent a lot of time, along with co-authors Solomon Messing and Sean Westwood, developing a categorization scheme for these press releases that were based on hand codes, and then we used some statistical models to extrapolate those hand codes. So we have a lot of evidence that those hand codes are quite accurate. And those hand codes, the counts for each of the legislators are on the horizontal axis here. On the vertical axis, we have the measures just from the algorithm I just ran. And what we see is that there's a really strong correlation between the two. It's not perfect, it's not one-to-one, but there is strong evidence that what's going on in this unsupervised model is also what's going on in this supervised model, giving us more reason to believe the estimates that are coming out of this model. Okay, so onto those dynamics. And so what we see here is, I think, a pretty interesting encapsulation of what happened in American politics at the end of the Bush administration and the start of the Obama administration. So in about 2005, Republicans and Democrats talked about money in their press releases at about the same rate. It was about a quarter of what they were discussing. This goes down in 2006 and 2007, a fair amount, but that goes down together. There's no real separation between the two. By 2008, we start to see some decline, perhaps substantial decline in the Republican Party, and Democrats don't have as big of a decline. But then in 2009, the stimulus passes, Obama's elected, and we see this surge in Democratic credit claiming. But Republicans maintain this low rate of credit claiming. At this same time, in 2009, of course, we have the Tea Party movement begins in earnest. People are protesting not just Obamacare, but also what they're viewing as broad government intrusion, government waste. And so that by 2010, we have a very big decrease in the Republican credit claiming rate. It's almost, it's below actually 10%. So it's more than, less than half of what it was before in 2005. So we see Republicans are moving away at a very fast rate from credit claiming, while Democrats at some point surge and at other times maintain essentially that same rate. So what's going on? Well, the model gives us another category that offers some suggestion about what might be happening. So here's an example statement of a press release that's in this other category. So this one's from Tom Price. He's a conservative Republican from Georgia. And he says, House Democrats have concocted the perfect recipe for a complete government takeover of the American healthcare system. So one of these categories, one of these topics looks like a discussion of sort of Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act in general. Another press release says, however, I find it stunning that the president, who has created a mountain of debt, now says we should not do so. Right, so this is in relation to some statements about various budgeting exercises. And of course, very famously, Eric Cantor says, the facts about the Democrats' budget, doubling the national debt over the next 8 years. And so each of these press releases are indicative of categories that the model discovers. These categories are topics that are broadly about the budget, about the Affordable Care Act, and the ways in which the Obama administration is presenting its work to the American people. So we can aggregate this up together in a similar way. And what we can see in both press releases and newsletters is that there is an increase in this sort of rhetoric among the GOP. This increase really begins in 2009 and carries through in 2010. If we then turn over to our newsletters, we see that this increase really increases. It reaches a crest in 2010 and 2011. So the Republican Party is moving away from this credit claiming rhetoric to this much more adversarial rhetoric, engaging the president and really defining its brand as being opposed to the Obama administration. Okay, so who's driving this change? Who are the people who are articulating the strongest objections? And so here on the horizontal axis, I've just plotted a thing political scientists call an ideal point. This one is just we could think about as a low-dimensional summary of how people have voted in Congress. You might think that sounds uninteresting. It turns out, by this fantastic fact of American politics, that this low-dimensional summary really does a great job of capturing the ideology of members. People who are closer to the middle tend to be more moderate. People to the left or the right tend to be more extreme. On the left, this blob of folks are Democrats. On the right are Republicans. And what you can see is that for Republicans, there is a strong relationship, at least through this local linear regression, between their ideology, this ideal point, and the rate at which they're engaging in this sort of, we might call branding or attacking type rhetoric, this aggregated rhetoric. There is a relationship perhaps for Democrats, maybe it's only found on the left there, and it's substantially weaker. So we can actually look within individual legislators and see who's driving this change. And so this plot here looks at the change within legislators from 2008 to 2010, and then just looks at how at the sort of scope of this change. And in particular, the con there means conservative. So this looks at the changes among conservatives, folks who are well aligned with their district, folks who come from districts in which they basically represent people who are like them, so Republicans from very Republican district, Democrats from very Democratic districts. And what we see is that the conservatives in both their newsletters and press releases, this is for Republicans, have the biggest decrease in their credit claiming rate. And in turn, they have the largest increase, or a bigger increase in their sort of attacking or critiquing rhetoric in their newsletters and press releases. Okay, so this suggests something that maybe you knew intuitively already about the Republican Party. So Republicans, after Obama gets elected, they abandon their many of them abandon their sort of long focus on claiming credit for money and instead replace that with critiques of the Obama administration. We ask, why does this matter? So to get a sense of this, I focus in on a subset of healthcare press releases. So these are press releases that are about, say, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act more generally. And I use an algorithm related to the one I just used called Leighton-Dirichlet allocation, and I fit that with 10 topics. And the idea of drilling in here is that we can get a sense of what people are talking about when they talk about healthcare. And then I look at attention to these various topics based on those ideal points that I described before. And I'm going to do this within party to focus in particular on the Republican Party. And so at the very top here, I think, is the sort of key finding from this exercise. On the right here, for each one of these topics, I'm looking at the attention for a conservative Republican, a median Republican, Republican in the middle of the caucus, and then a moderate Republican. In this top line here, we're looking at attention to a topic that's clearly about a government takeover. These are people who are saying that the Affordable Care Act is the government intruding into a private medical market. And what we see is that conservatives are disproportionately talking about this government takeover relative to this median member of the caucus, whereas moderate members of the Republican Party tend to avoid discussing things like a government takeover of healthcare. Instead, these moderate members would be talking about things like pre-existing conditions and in some cases, small businesses, right? So there are Republicans who are articulating more moderate, less hyperbolic rhetoric. They just turn out to be the people not engaging in this discussion most regularly. And so this same dynamic is actually found among liberal Democrats during the Bush administration. So the most liberal Democrats tend to allocate much more attention to criticizing Bush budgets and much less attention to sort of compromise blue dog spending proposals, which isn't surprising given sort of like the definition of what a blue dog is. Okay, so this is evidence that extremists are attacking the other party's brand with perhaps hyperbolic rhetoric. So this is one version of this sort of attack, and this is sort of policy-based evaluations. We might not say that this is really anti-democratic. This is just the exchange of ideas. It gets a little colored, but that's okay. And so the topics then give us a sense of how policy is portrayed negatively, but we wanted to get a sense of what's really going on in a sort of anti-deliberative sense. And so in particular, we wanted to study something that we call taunting, or the incidence of vitriol. And we define taunting to be attacks made by members of one party on the other party or its members. And so this is really about attacking the other party's competency, or what political scientists would call its valence. And so to get at this sort of vitriolic content and speeches, we couldn't use machine coding. We tried very hard, but it turns out to be a very hard thing to get a machine to code. So instead, we've engaged in this sort of massive effort. We've hired lots of undergrads, fed them lots of pizza, paid them actual money, and they've been tagging floor speeches. We're now at about 60,000. For this result here, I'll show you about 30,000. We categorize these into taunting or vitriolic statements and other categories. And so we have a really high agreement rate on this taunting, which took us quite some time to get right. And there's some face validity. And then we've also developed some methods to incorporate our uncertainty from hand coding going forward to present the estimates. And the results I'll show you, we have some mild smoothing that's going to let us show you some overtime dynamics that'll be pretty nice. And the result of this process is that we're going to have senator year measures of their taunting rate. So we can get a sense of who's taunting and then how that taunting changes over time. And so if you, are writing a thought piece for like the New Yorker, you say the Senate's gotten worse. If you're retiring from the Senate, you always say the Senate got worse, right? So like I arrived and there were puppies and everybody loved each other, and now it's like Game of Thrones up in here, right? And so that is just not what happened. Okay, so this is just this overtime rate. So in black we have the GOP, in gray we have for Democrats. This is the taunting rate. One thing to note is that like proportion of speeches in which people are taunting, it's not exceedingly high. It's not 50%. So it peaks at about sort of 10%. And so we see that it reaches a maximum for the Republicans in 1995. This makes sense. This is post Republican Revolution. Gingrich is in the House, working hard to attack the Clinton administration. There are a number of new Republicans in the Senate who have some sort of House ties, who are also driving this taunting. The taunting actually decreases during the impeachment trial. You may recall that the Senate was actually sort of acting like the adults in the room during that and didn't actually convict Clinton on that impeachment. It reaches a low point in 2001 and 2002 after the sort of 9/11 attacks. But then we see taunting rates among Democrats spike again in 2003 as the Bush administration starts pushing the country to war in Iraq. And just like with that, the critiquing rhetoric in the topics, we see that extremists are the ones who are engaging in the taunting rates at the highest, taunting at the highest rates. And in particular, this is found in the latter years of our studies. So in 2004, 5, and 6 especially, here we have that ideal point on the horizontal axis, we see that Democrats and Republicans who are at the extreme of their party are the ones who are taunting at the highest rates. So they're the ones who are going to the floor, calling the other party names, and not engaging in the sorts of exchange of ideas that we may think are particularly useful. So taken together, what does this all suggest? So party branding is often thought of in political science based upon actions in the institution, but we want to make a focus on the sort of marketing effort that goes along with it. But if we focus on this marketing effort, we have this collective action problem that automatically arises. And the collective action problem is that we're all of us who share a party label, are going to be associated with what people are saying, and members of our party have different incentives to articulate different things, as certainly Ted Cruz illuminates. And so that if extremists dominate that discussion, other members of the party will be associated with rhetoric, that is disconcerting or not helpful for their own individual electoral conditions. And so the result of this process, the various incentives that legislators face, is that the party spokesperson for each of the parties turns out to be the most adversarial and vitriolic legislator in the party. So that's what I have. Thank you.